1989 as a grad student, and my twice-a-year visits every year since, I would say their Puritanism, that is, their denial of the pleasures of the flesh, so contrasting with the joie de vivre of French culture, in which I lived for more than a decade. Plus their religiosity. Some 80% of Americans still believe in religious superstitions 2,000 years old. Their nationalism, their insane gun laws, etc. All frozen 19th century European values that the Europeans grew out of in the 20th century, often based on bitter experience of two major, that is, world European wars. To understand the profound insularity of the Japanese, one needs to understand their geographical situation and their history. Japan is an island, and a large one, with the world's 8th largest population, after China, India, America, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia and Pakistan, and hence is culturally self-sustaining. It's also an ancient nation, going back more than 2,000 years to the last major wave of immigration from Korea. In fact, genetically speaking, DNA terms, ad-libbing here, Japanese are Koreans. So the early emperors in Japan were Korean emperors. But you can't tell the Japs that. The nearest country, other than some minor islands in the north, is Korea, which is hundreds of kilometers away. So Japan is really isolated in geographical terms. The British are insular for similar reasons, but France is only 30 kilometers away. Island cultures are harder to invade, so they tend to evolve independently of their overseas continental neighbours. The Japanese have had rice for over 1,000 years, which supported high population densities, resulting in centuries-long overcrowding, which in turn created constant stresses and tensions. To overcome these frustrations, Japanese social control has traditionally been very authoritarian, often brutally so, if one reads Japanese history. For example, when Catholicism grew in the 17th century under Portuguese influence, it became so popular that the ruling elite felt threatened enough to stamp it out, murdering over 1 million Japanese Catholics, and then sealing off the country for 2 centuries to foreign influence, until the Americans forced open the country with gunboat diplomacy and superior military technology. This history has kept the Japanese culturally and intellectually isolated from the rest of the world for centuries. The Japanese are one of the most culturally homogeneous peoples in the world. The minorities in Japan, the Koreans, about 700,000, the Ainu, the Aborigines of Japan, in the north, only about 50,000, and the Burakumin, or ETA, ETA, Japan's untouchable caste of about 3 million. More on the mistreatment of Japan's minorities later. Are a small percentage of the total population, about over 125 million. I think the largest Japanese population reach was 128 million, and then its population started declining because young people aren't having kids, so it's now down to about 127 million or so, the last I heard. So the vast majority are the mainstream Japanese with a common language and common cultural history. The Japanese understand intuitively how other Japanese think, which makes communication easy. But when everyone behaves in a given way, due largely to historically and ecologically necessary social pressures on Japanese to behave according to set patterns, which have evolved over the centuries to preserve the peace in an overcrowded country, any foreign behaviour sticks out like a sore thumb. Few Japanese people have lived overseas, and their command of spoken English is so poor, until very recently amongst the young, that first-hand experience of life outside Japan is a closed book to most Japanese. Only about 10% of the Japanese population has even left Japan. Less than 1% can speak good English. Even the teachers of English in the high schools cannot speak the language well. Only recently have native English-speaking English language teachers been imported in large numbers to Japan's high schools, the JET, J-E-T, what would that stand for, Japanese English Teacher, maybe, program, to overcome this major handicap. The Japanese are a proud, even arrogant people who have a strong desire to make a mark in the world, but cannot because they cannot express themselves well in international forums where fluent English is mandatory. It took me 2 years of living in Japan to realize how deeply insular is the mentality of the Japanese. I had always lived in multicultured societies, so from an early age I became used to multicultural differences and learned that there are many different customs and attitudes to life. In Japan, however, the Japanese are not exposed to multiculturalism, so they grow up unconsciously thinking that there is only one good, way of doing things, that is, the Japanese way. And since in Japan social pressure to conform to group norms is high to preserve the peace and three-generational one-roomed houses over centuries of farm and village life, the Japanese, even intellectuals, often have a really hard time accepting at the emotional level, as against a more liberal intellectual level, the idea that differences in behavioural patterns should not be censored. To me, this monoculturalism is unsophisticated and uncosmopolitan. I lived in Brussels for more than a decade, one of the most cosmopolitan cities on the planet, with 1 person in 4 being a foreigner, capital of the European Union, EU, NATO's headquarters, etc. I'll mention this point in other contexts later, but for my daily living, the intercultural incompetence of the Japanese is what gets me down the most, and there's not much that can be done about it until digital stationary orbit global 1000 channel TV arrives, making the Japanese suddenly realize at an emotional level that there's a big world out there, 50 times bigger in world population terms. Not a real democracy. To anyone watching CNN around the world, it would appear that Japan is a democracy. Well, it is and it isn't. In Japanese hearts, democracy is foreign, imposed upon them by a conquering, nuclear-powered American military under General MacArthur, which attempted to democratize the Japanese people so that they would not go to war again and murder 30 million of their Asian neighbors. Prior to MacArthur, Japan had been a deeply authoritarian country. Not more than a century ago, it was the right of the ruling samurai, that's the warrior class, to cut off the head of a peasant farmer who did not give the samurai enough respect. Even today, the Japanese public is incredibly politically and socially passive as seen by Westerners. It's part of Confucianist and Buddhist philosophy to accept things as they are and not complain. Of course, the foundation of a real democracy is that the public complain about things that need to be removed or reformed. The level of the development of grassroots democracy in Japan I'd put at about a century behind the West. The younger generation, exposed to America's Hollywood and CNN, etc., is slowly becoming more westernized, but the bulk of the population is rather stolid and passive. Actually, in my view, modernization and westernization are the same thing. If modernization had occurred first in the East, then westernization would be called easternization by Westerners. The East calls modernization westernization because it sees modern ways first in the West. This passivity creates all kinds of social problems for the Japanese, but since they are so insular and ignorant of how people live in other countries, they simply don't realize how much they suffer through ignorance. If no one complains, nothing gets changed. Without change, there's no improvement. Japan to me is a very socially conservative country, one that I have little pride in, socially speaking. MacArthur did not do a good job in democratizing Japan. The Americans were in a rush to get back to the US and did not systematically root out Japanese fascism and authoritarian rule, with the result that as soon as they left, the Japanese bureaucracy, which was hardly dismantled at all, quickly took power and began to run the country the way it wanted. That is, a small group of men, admittedly intellectually brilliant in many cases, but unelected, simply imposed its will on a passive, obedient, hard-working Japanese people, desperate to re-establish their material standard of living after being fire and bombed flat by the Americans. In a culture of little collective criticism, this kind of dictatorship is possible. The Japanese politicians are in reality rather useless, changing their ministerial posts every 6 months or so, and being no match intellectually for the Mandarin bureaucrats, who are the creme de la creme of Japan's education system. As an example of this kind of bureaucratic rule and the abuses it can give rise to, take the case of Japan, this is in 97, still not allowing the mini-dose contraceptive pill. Japan is one of the very few industrialized countries in the world not to have the mini pill, along with ultra-conservative Catholic Ireland. The old larger dose pills are obtainable to treat heavy period pains, etc., but the mini pill is still banned. Why? Well, the generally accepted hypothesis seems to be that the Japanese Medical Association is very powerful and lobbies the Ministry of Health bureaucrats to persuade them to declare to the public that the mini pill is unsafe with dangerous side effects. The Japanese are too insular to realize that the rest of the world uses the mini pill, including dozens of countries with medical systems more advanced than Japan's. to no great danger, but such thinking would not occur to most Japanese, such is the strength of their inward-looking mentality. However, Japan was the first country in the world to get legalized abortion on demand in 1948, largely as a consequence of Japanese disgust at the half-caste babies born of Japanese women and black US soldiers. Those born were shipped off to the Japanese communities in Brazil, and the rest were aborted. Without the mini-pill, abortion still plays a major contraceptive role in Japan, with an estimated 2 million abortions a year. That is about 1 abortion per woman per lifetime. The medical profession cashes in mightily. The gynecologists do not want to see the mini-pill come in, nor do the condom manufacturers, nor do the ultra-conservative bureaucrats, who are horrified at the idea of young Japanese women taking control of their own bodies and sex lives by initiating sex, the way their Western sisters have taken for granted since the early 1960s. Since the women's movement in Japan is a joke, that is, has no punch at all, nothing changes. The mini-pill has been banned for decades. In this respect, Japan is decades behind the West. A basis for a healthy grassroots democracy, where the public imposes its will on its elected representatives, who then legislate laws and command the bureaucrats, who should be civil servants, to execute the laws, is that the public be informed of what is wrong with society. A vigorous and independent press is essential for democracy. However, in Japan, the media is largely controlled by the politicians and the ministries. Favoured journalists, that is, the non-critical ones, who don't pry into the politicians' or bureaucrats' indiscretions or corrupt practices, of which there are many, Japan being a most corrupt society, with constant scandals eventually breaking through the media damper, are invited to press conferences. There's very little tradition of muckraking or independent investigative journalism in Japan. Japanese journalists are Japanese and hence lack the necessary individualistic mentality to be effective investigative reporters. Even those who are face resistance from the Japanese public because such individualist behaviour disturbs the wa, social harmony. The net result is that the Japanese public is poorly informed of what is happening, so it's not surprising that they are so passive. In Japan, in practice, it's the bureaucrats who make the laws. They propose them, and the politicians largely rubber stamp them. It's the bureaucrats who effectively rule, and it was the bureaucrats who simply dictated that the Japanese would have poor housing, high prices, few airports, a memory-based education system, etc. The Japanese public simply passively accepts this, not knowing that they could live better lives if only they were more cosmopolitan in their outlook. For 2 generations now, the Japanese have had to put up with high prices that are often double or more in purchasing power terms compared to those in Western countries. The general public is not consulted. After centuries of repressive dictatorial government, the Japanese are not accustomed to raising their voices in anger and insisting on changes. Of course, this does occur to some extent, but much less than in the West, with the result that Japan is seen as being socially backward by Westerners. Historically, one of the reasons why the shoguns, that's the Japanese military dictators, in the 17th century were so threatened by the rise of Catholicism was that this Western doctrine was capable of getting large numbers of Japanese peasants into the streets to protest, something unheard of prior to the arrival of Westerners in Japan. However, the dictatorship of the Japanese bureaucracy does have a positive side to it. The bureaucrats are not stupid. They are the country's intellectual elite, and they think long-term, although in Confucianist terms. They reason that it would be better for Japan to sacrifice the emotional happiness of 1 or 2 generations of Japanese by having them work hard and paying high prices as a form of forced saving. The high savings rate thus created cheap capital, which got ploughed back into company investment. With cheap capital and high prices, the companies made considerable profits, which allowed them to grow, and Japan has grown spectacularly since World War II, however at great social cost. My general impression is that the Japanese are not a particularly happy people. There are too many social pressures, too many social obligations, and not enough individual liberty for them to feel happy. The pressure cooker of Japan's economic growth machine, until the collapse of the speculative bubble economy in the 1990s, has been achieved at the cost of creating a rather emotionally impoverished Japanese public, I feel. Only now are the more affluent younger Japanese under 30 beginning to rebel against the old model, spending their time and energy on their own individualistic hobbies. But even then, they don't complain collectively. They merely privately do what they want and don't rock the boat. One of Japan's biggest problems, I feel, is its political and social passivity. There is social pressure against complaining in Japan. A good Japanese simply grins and bears it. This political docility led to the rise of Japanese fascism in the 1930s, resulting in 30 million Asians being murdered by the Japanese military in the 1930s and 1940s. The Japanese people did not have the courage in the 1930s to stop the rise of a fascist military dictatorship, which made itself hated by its cruelty and inhumanity towards its Asian neighbours. Such is the price which is paid sometimes for a lack of democratic spirit in a population. As George Bernard Shaw famously said, "People get the leaders they deserve." Sex roles. In the early 1980s in Europe, I was a very active masculist, that is, men's liber. Masculism is my word, by the way, which I coined in the mid-1970s. I was on the European media about 150 times, preaching the gospel of women's careers to free men from the burden of being the sole breadwinner of the family. The main idea was, now that women can work, they must work. Otherwise, they parasitize on men and thus enslave them. To force fluffies, that is, a masculine label for traditional women who are financially parasitic on men, to become fips, that is, financially independent persons, another masculine term. Masculine's ideological strategy was to frighten them with the slogan, "If you want to get a man, get a career." Masculine's influenced men realized in Northern Europe, a region which is about a decade ahead of the US in social attitudes, for example, full sexual intercourse on TV, unmarried couples living together, abortion pill, atheism, female careers, etc., that there were many advantages in having a serious relationship with a FIP. A FIP is far cheaper to divorce. Traditionally, a man would pay for a woman, a fluffy, before a divorce and then after the divorce, so he's paying for a woman he doesn't love, pure parasitism on the woman's part. Women are now living until they are 80, having small children for only a handful of years, so they have plenty of time for careers. Having a relationship with a FIP makes switching careers easier for a man, because she is sharing more or less equally with him the burden of earning the family living. He can then afford to earn less and maybe get a better qualification by going back to university for a couple of years. If he's a robot, that is a masculine term for a traditional monodimensional workaholic male who unquestioningly accepts having a fluffy as a wife, then he will probably be locked into a financial prison with no flexibility to earn 10%, 20%, 40% less, because he is forced to earn as much as possible to pay for the kids' school fees, the mortgage, his wife's dresses, etc. He's forced to stick with the same job that he may hate or be bored with. If you're working 8 hours a day all your life in a job that you hate or are bored by but can't get out of it because you are locked into a financial prison, then you are truly unliberated. Masculism is men's liberation, and the biggest problem for masculists is female financial parasitism. Fluffified or fluffied men often hate their lives because they cannot change them. Once millions of European men began to wake up to this idea, especially in the Scandinavian countries, the most socially advanced in the world, fluffies really began to feel the pressure. The women's feminist movement was strongly advocating careers for women. With a divorce rate of 50% in many countries, being a fluffy is financially risky. What happens if you lose the man you parasite upon? Men increasingly rejected the idea of alimony, that is, money paid by ex-husbands to ex-wives, labelling it a parasite's charter. Along came the masculists, who tried to make men conscious that you're better off with a FIP than a fluffy. Fluffies cannot even survive unless there are robots, that's traditional men, around who are willing to be parasitized upon. As more and more men took up masculist attitudes, the remaining fluffies, who had not yet converted themselves into being FIPs, began to panic. They could afford to ignore the feminists, but if their own husbands started thinking along masculist lines, then that was truly dangerous. I used to be given dagger eyes by fluffies in the tram in Brussels the day after I had been on national TV pushing masculism. But over the years, the percentage of women getting careers in the West rose and rose, until fluffies in many countries effectively died out. It's now the norm in the sense of a social expectation, that is, a social pressure from peers, parents, etc., for young women in the West to have a career. More importantly, their boyfriends expect it too. Fluffies are out. Once women had careers, their husbands began to respect them more, because the women had new financial and emotional bargaining power. They could say to their husbands that if they were neglectful or unpleasant, the wives could divorce them more easily because of their new financial independence. The husbands found their careerist wives a lot more stimulating than their former boring housewifey wives, and could share common careerist experience and difficulties with them. Communication between husbands and wives in the West thus improved, and hence the quality of their sex. Dual career coupledom definitely had its advantages, although there were new problems, such as what to do if the two spouses worked far apart. The usual solution to this problem was to move to a big city where both could find local jobs. Now that I'm in Japan, I feel like I've stepped into a time machine. The Japanese are backward when it comes to sex roles. They're like the West in the early 1960s, and hence are at least 30 years behind in this respect. They have not had their sexual revolution yet. The mini pill is still banned in Japan, that the West had in the early 1960s. So Japanese women don't even have control of their own bodies and sex lives. They have not had the feminist revolution that the West had in the 1970s, because Japanese women are too passive, and they have not had the masculist revolution that the Northern Europe, and to a lesser extent the US, had in the 1980s. In any country, the feminist revolution has to precede the masculist revolution, because husbands cannot work less and earn less until their wives earn more. Since there's been no real feminist revolution in Japan, and few Japanese women have real careers, as against pin money part-time jobs, which are very common, Japanese fluffy women financially enslave Japanese robot men. Since being a masculist was a very important part of my self-image in the early 1980s, seeing the level of underdevelopment of Japan's sex roles makes me ashamed of Japan. It's a source of great frustration for me, because I like to have a certain pride in the country I choose to live in. But in Japan, the trade-off I make between the advantages of economic and career opportunities on the one hand, and the disadvantages of feeling I'm living in a third world country in terms of social development on the other, causes me to have an air of permanent absent-mindedness. The conflict eats up much of my nervous energy and is terribly distracting. It's not easy being a cosmopole. The more countries one has lived in, the easier it becomes to see the weaknesses of the country one is currently living in. I feel sorry for Japanese men. They work long hours, often 10 or 11 a day, with 2, 3, even 4-hour daily commute time. This is not a life. House and land prices are so high that to have affordable housing, their families have to live far from the city centres, so commute times have become excessive. Japan is so out of touch with Western social values and is so insular that the Japanese do not see themselves as socially backward, e.g. more than 30 years behind the West in terms of sex roles. What nowadays, ad-libbing, tend to be called gender roles. In America or English-speaking countries, the word sex tends to be confined to sexual intercourse nowadays, and sex roles would now be called gender roles. Back to the book. Most Japanese men consider it perfectly normal that it is their role to earn the money for the family, and that their wives do not have careers, earning only pin money in part-time jobs after the kids are off to school. Japanese husbands just don't see themselves yet as being exploited by their financially parasitic wives. In fact, a lot of them, as company employers, don't want to employ women for careers. Women in Japan face far greater sexist employment hurdles than in the West, but because of Confucianist social values, these women don't rock the boat. Japanese women have not yet organized themselves into powerful feminist organizations to sue rogue sexist male employers, the way Western women did in the 1970s. So of course nothing happens, and Japan simply falls further and further behind the West in social terms. If you mention this kind of thing to the Japanese, they'll often just say that Japan is different from the West, that Japan is a different culture, going in a different direction. This is false, I believe. Japan is going through the same modernization process in terms of sex roles, for example, as dozens of other developing nations. Because the Japanese are decades behind the West in this regard, Westerners can look at Japan and see the West's past, and can see that Japan is developing along the same growth curve as the West, but is decades behind. The Japanese, on the other hand, cannot look into their future, and hence cannot see that they are moving along the same growth curve. Hence it is easy for Japanese to think that they are different, a characteristic of the Japanese that they love to emphasize, with some basis of truth, but also highly exaggerated at times. So it's a frustrating dialogue for a Westerner to talk about sex roles with the Japanese. Also, the Japanese are a proud people who are acutely sensitive to Western criticism. The Japanese have a love-hate relationship with the West, and America in particular. For a century, the Japanese have tried to catch up with the West, to beat them. Economically, this goal has been more or less achieved, but socially, Japan is way behind. So by criticizing Japanese social values, a Westerner touches on the ultra-sensitive inferiority complex Japanese have towards Westerners. This inferiority complex is manifested frequently and routinely in an implicit manner in Japan's ads. Putting a Westerner in a Japanese ad gives the product advertised a certain class and unconscious association in the Japanese mind of, quote, the product must be good because Westerners are using it. So when Westerners like me say such things as, quote, Japan is still basically a third world authoritarian country which got rich quickly, end quote, the Japanese have a great deal of trouble accepting such opinions, even though it's true to Western eyes. Japanese husbands work such long hours until very recently that they got home exhausted. The kids have already gone to bed, so Japanese fathers in effect orphan their children and often emotionally and sexually widow their wives. The division of tasks in the average Japanese household, and particularly for the older generation, is so polarized that men and women live in two different worlds. The husbands often leave control of the household entirely up to their wives, including control of his salary spending. She will give him a weekly allowance from his own salary. Traditional Japanese values place more emphasis on the mother-child relationship than on the wife-husband relationship. The child will often sleep with the mother, so sex tends to go out the window. It's not surprising after a few years of this that love and tenderness between husband and wife dies. There's an expression in Japan that, quote, a good husband is healthy and absent. As proof of this, in case you think, if you're a Westerner, that I'm exaggerating, was a survey taken in Japan a few years ago asking Japanese men and women, what is it in your life that makes life worth living? Only 5% of both sexes said their spouse. Such statistics are profoundly shocking to Westerners, who place much higher importance on love, tenderness and sex with their spouses. To Westerners, large numbers of Japanese, especially the old generation, seem rather masochistic, expressing a rather sad, resigned look on their faces when compared with the joie de vivre of many other peoples, for example the French or Italians. The Japanese insularity is so strong that they don't know that they are sad. It is this ignorance of other, happier ways of living, which are to be found in many other countries, that I find the most frustrating about the Japanese, as I said earlier. One of the first things that one learns when living in a second country/culture is that it's possible for millions of people to do themselves damage by accepting inferior customs, simply through ignorance. Being cosmopolitan teaches you the value of questioning the social values of one's locality. One learns that, quote, there are better ways of living which make people happier. In this respect, the Japanese have much to learn. I believe that the Japanese really suffer from their insularity and live lives of relative emotional, sexual and existential poverty because they are unable to benefit from the social lessons learnable from other cultures. Japan is too culturally closed-minded, too inward-looking to benefit from importing new social innovation.